Hello and welcome to another episode of Osgoode Community Chronicles, where we explore the rich history, vibrant events, and remarkable stories that make up the Osgoode ward and surrounding communities. In each episode, we dive deep into our local heritage, drawing from the meticulous records and research of our local historians and families. These invaluable resources allow us to bring you stories from the past, ensuring that the traditions that shaped our community are shared with future generations. Whether you're a lifelong resident like me, or a newcomer, join us as we tie our fascinating history to the present-day version of our beloved region of Osgoode and surrounding communities. I'm your host, Tracy Daviero. Merry Christmas! I know it was last week, but I haven't seen you since then, and we still are officially in the holidays. I actually had intended to publish this episode last week, but the holidays we speak of had other plans for me. It's been busy. It's been awesome, but leading up to Christmas was pretty crazy, I guess probably as it usually is. We've since had some really nice downtime, and we're looking forward to New Year's Eve tonight. First at Bailey Mussel and Jessica Pachette's stag, and then home to ring in the new year with our regular gang. A very happy new year to you. I wanted to start off this week by mentioning a wonderful woman who we have lost. One of my faithful podcast listeners, actually, Chris O'Brien. I was so sad to hear this news last week. Chris was just such a wonderful lady. Every time I ever saw her in recent years, she would stop for a chat. I know she liked to talk, but she was really good at listening too. She was always smiling and always interested in what somebody else had to say. I so wish I got over to talk to her about this podcast and gather some of her best memories. Of course, she is a Kelly Kelly descendant, I guess, from the River Road Kellys. Her mom, Katie Kelly, was Arnold Kelly's sister. So she had lots of memories of growing up here and being here. And I guess I'll have to meet with her kids to get some of those now. It's another lesson in not missing an opportunity to have a coffee or even just some conversation with someone whenever you can. I loved Chris, and I know many others did too. She and that $1 million smile will truly be missed. In today's episode, we are off to Kenmore. We'll have our news and events calendar as usual, slim as it may be. Our business segment is a little about the Carkner lumber mill, and our historical segment features the Carkner family. Our community voices segment is about Kenmore, and as usual, we'll wrap up with our mental health moment, a bit of a special one. Let's get into it. Every week on the podcast, we share some of the local events that are taking place in the area. So many great people doing great things. Please be sure that you get out to support them. First off, I saw a comment in an Osgoode Village group for someone asking about Mrs. Bowers, who taught Bible study school in the late 70s, early 80s on Osgoode Main Street. They were looking for her homemade buns recipe that she served with hot chocolate after school. Did anybody ever get that? I'd love to see it too. There was a comment that said Ruth Morrison might have that, and I do intend to speak with Mrs. Morrison coming up in the new year, so we'll think about that buns recipe whenever we're over there and hope she has it. The Manotick United Church has a puzzle exchange every Wednesday from 10 a.m. till noon, and homemade pies are available for sale during these hours. They also host euchre every Monday at 1:30, except on holiday Mondays. If you are looking to get rid of your Christmas tree, the Vanderland Barnyard Zoo in Winchester is a petting zoo that takes about 150 trees each year to feed and shelter their animals. They house goats, sheep, alpacas, and cattle. Get in touch with them to arrange to get your tree to them. The ODRs in all of our villages were open for a little bit, and now I think are all closed again with this unseasonably mild weather. As always, thank you to the volunteers who maintain these for the community, and hopefully we'll get some more snow again soon, and they'll all be open for public use. Same goes for the ice, though. We did see some shacks getting put out a couple of weeks ago. Surely the ice is not safe to be on right now, so be patient for ice fishing season. It sure does look like it's on the way. The temperatures are dropping again next week. A few events that are coming up. January 9th, the Greeley Gardeners Group is having their January general meeting at the Greeley Community Center, and this month's speaker is Master Gardener Mary Shearman Reed, who is talking about vertical gardening, vines, and trailers. Tickets are available online for that event. The Greeley Gardeners are also seeking members at large, so if you're interested in gardening, get in touch with them. January 10th, is the deadline to fill in the online survey for the ATV Club. They're looking to expand the current ATV trail network, and there's a survey online to collect your feedback and opinion. You can view the existing and the proposed trails in maps that are available online as well. We'll leave the links to those things on our website. The trail goes all through our area already, but the proposed expansion serves primarily to connect the trails in Ward 20, Osgoode, to the other trails in the OFATV clubs and to improve access to the villages as well. And a little bit further out, on January 18th, the Russell Legion is starting to host events again. They are hosting their euchre tournament starting at 7 p.m. on January 18th. All levels are welcome, no partner needed. The cost is $15 per player and includes light snacks. And we're starting to get the winter carnivals for the villages on the map as well. We'll tell you a lot more about those in some upcoming episodes. Well, look at our senators, eh? I told you I had faith. I don't know if all of you guys did, but honestly, they have been playing really well. I love it. Currently holding on to that last wild card spot and hoping our goalie injuries are resolved soon. Although Allmark has been very hot, the back injury is a little worrisome. Marlainen has been holding his own though, so go Sens go. Of course, the World Juniors are underway, and Canada, unfortunately, is just not looking like the powerhouse we have been in other years. We naturally were disappointed that Carter Yakimchuk was not selected, even after they had to call up two other guys in the last couple of days. It would have been really nice to see him. But it was nice to see him meet up with the Sens in Calgary just before Christmas. But this would have been a terrific stage for him here at Ottawa in the juniors. He did just break the franchise record on the Calgary Hitmen for the most goals by a defenseman with 64. 6 goals and 6 assists in his last 10 games. Kind of shocking that Hockey Canada doesn't consider that worthy. Well, he'll be in Ottawa before long anyway. For Team Canada, they're facing the States tonight in the last game of the group stage. And it's anybody's guess what's going to happen, right? I guess next week I'll be reporting only on the results, but it's really just crazy in Group A. We'll have to see where Canada lands and how that all plays out. And the Manotick Mariners won their last home game of 2024 by a score of 8-4 against the Arnprior Rivermen, with a 4-2 score after the first period. I don't know about you, but I love high-scoring games. Of course, it helps if your team wins the game, but a lot of goals just makes for better entertainment to me. People love to see goals. Fans love to see goals, right? The Mariners have a whopping plus 43 goal differential, second only to the North Dundas Rockets in their league. The Rockets are undefeated all season with just one win that was decided in overtime. The rest of them, they have won in regulation. These two teams are going to meet in Manotick on January 25th, so that ought to be a great game. Although the last time they met, it was a very low-scoring game. The Rockets won 3-2, but the shots were 49-25 in favor of North Dundas. So still probably going to be a very exciting matchup. That's January 25th. Mark your calendar. And that is our news and events for this week. This week's Business Spotlight is about the Carkner Lumber Mill in Kenmore. From the Osgoode Township Historical Society newsletter, an excerpt by Anne Leighton Kyle. Kenmore has a rich and proud heritage and the backing of a caring community. Fearing a loss to the greatest of its past, many caring residents have put effort into preserving the past and making its past known to the newcomers of the village. Businesses have dwindled on the main street, and the community is fast becoming a suburb of Ottawa. New subdivisions outline and follow the Castor River, but many have filled stately, older homes in the central core. A notable site on the main street is the Kenmore Community Hall, which is well-maintained and used often. Kenmore community residents in 1997 banded together to create a community program, Kenmore Goes for Green, and has been responsible for planting trees in the park, hanging flower baskets, and generally keeping the place attractive. A tree was placed at the old Carkner Mill site, presently owned by Stephen Curry. Betty Kingsbury, as a member of the community, thought Carkner Mill needed more recognition and took it upon herself to have a plaque installed on a rock at the site of the mill. An unveiling took place on July 22, 2004, and about 20 guests with Kenmore background and interest were invited, with a tea following. Councillor Doug Thompson was present, as well as Lila Clarmo, Norma Carkner Cinnamon, Doris Loney, Frances Bowman, Charlotte and Cecil Rainey, Ida van der Linden, and Betty and Ken Kingsbury. The Carkner mill had operated continually from 1876 to 1964, one of many industries in Kenmore. An excerpt of what Norma Carkner Cinnamon wrote in the Society newsletter in 1976 left the information about the mill. Carkner mill founder, Duncan Carkner, was born March 7, 1854, at Harmony, Mountain Township. In his 20s, he joined John McMaster, and together they moved to Kenmore with the intention to build a mill. As the story goes, they had trouble convincing people that although they were young, they were serious. The sawmill was completed at 10% interest, with machinery having been brought in by horses from Mooresburg. It was expanded a number of times and had manufactured dressed lumber and shingles. In 1882, the mill expanded to make cheese boxes, and eventually a sash and door factory was added. John McMaster, who had married Duncan's sister Annie, left the partnership and moved to Washington State, building mills near Seattle in a place he named Kenmore. Duncan married Matilda Johnson, who had come from Ireland with her family. Their first home was just west of the mill, but later a beautiful frame house was built on Main Street. Jenny Watson Wallen wrote in 1976 in a foreword to the Society publication Families, "Turning east off Main Street, we meander down a road along the river and are reminded of Goldsmith's deserted village. This is the place the mills used to be, and there used to be so much activity, but they have all been torn down." The mills were located on the banks of the Castor River. On one side was the sash and door, the grist mill, and the cheese box factory. Across the road was the sawmill. The Castor, which fringed our village, and which gave a great deal of happiness to young and old. There was swimming, boating, hockey, skating. We would skate to Russell and back, a round trip of 10 miles, and enjoy every minute of it. My father, Hugh Watson, worked in the sash and door factory from the time he was a teenager until he was 78. The beautiful windows in the churches in the district were made by him. I well remember my grandmother saying that she loved to sit out on her veranda and listen to the hum of the mill, knowing it was bringing happiness and contentment to the people in the little and happy village of Kenmore. The Carkner mill was also designated a heritage property by the City of Ottawa in 2004. The city's recommendation report read, "The site of the former Carkner lumber mill in the village of Kenmore has recently been purchased." This was in 2004, and it was Don Watson who purchased it at the time. The new owner approached the city regarding the possibility of designation of the complex of 3 buildings under the Ontario Heritage Act. Staff visited the site, undertook preliminary research, and determined that the site has cultural heritage significance and merits designation. The designation process is very interesting and is outlined on the City of Ottawa website. I'll share some links to the documents submitted and the reports on the website with this episode. There is a heritage survey, an evaluation that gets submitted with supporting documentation, research, and attributes noted, like materials the buildings are made of, architectural design, description of the site, and a description of the interior of the buildings as relevant. A decision is made, and notice of intention to designate published in the paper, and gives the municipality a chance to object within 30 days. The research showed that the mill played a major role in the economic history of Kenmore. At its peak, the mill employed as many as 30 men and produced cheese boxes, rough and dressed lumber, wood veneer, sash and doors and kitchen cabinets, built-in furniture, and water tanks. It was one of 4 mills that harnessed the Castor River to drive machinery in the 19th century. A fire destroyed the original buildings in 1921, but the mill was rebuilt. A steam generator was the new source of power. The number of buildings on site when the mill was operational varied, but 3 remain: the office and showroom, the mill building, and the storage shed were left behind to show the bustling operation that was there for nearly 100 years. The former mill is also an important reminder of the stage in the economic history of Ottawa when small resource-based industries thrived in the small village and hamlets of the region. This is a well-deserved honor to be designated a heritage site in Kenmore, which sounds like it was quite a bustling place back in the day, now very much a suburban community village. And it's also noted that although the mill sat along the Castor River, In its almost 100-year history, water did not ever drive its machinery. And that's our business spotlight for this week. This week's historical segment follows the Carkner family, well, as best we can. The descendants of John Conrad Carkner and Virtue Lord are documented in the book The Descendants of John Conrad Carkner, The History of the Carkner Family in Canada. It's an excellent name for a book. And again, we get into the Scots naming their children after their ancestors, and there are a lot of duplicates here too, but I think I've gotten it pretty straight. John and Virtue's son Nehemiah married Annie MacDonald. They had 7 children: Annie, Virtue, Julia, John, Nehemiah, Margaret, and Thomas. Their son, Nehemiah, who in my book says Nehemiah the third, but only the second time you're hearing it, he also married a woman named Annie MacDonald. This Annie's parents were Duncan MacDonald and Annie McIntosh. They lived on Lot 3, Concession 5. I suspect she's a MacDonald from the same family as those who settled with the Fergusons, if you remember that episode a few episodes ago. Remember, on the 23rd of June, 1828, 3 families all applied for and were approved for land that same day. John Ferguson got southwest half lot 6, concession 4. Duncan Ferguson got southwest half lot 7, concession 6. And Duncan MacDonald got southwest half lot 3, concession 5. I believe this Duncan MacDonald is the same one, Annie MacDonald Carkner's parents. They lived about 2 miles west of Ormond, which became the Carkner family property for 59 years. They were both baptized in the Castor River and were charter members of the Ormond Baptist Church. They were very involved in the Kenmore Baptist Church with Reverend Daniel MacPhail, and they had 10 children. Annie, Duncan, Nehemiah, Virtue, Elizabeth, Catherine, John, Jesse, Robert, and Permilla. All of these children remained in the general area except for Annie and Elizabeth. Annie was the daughter of Duncan MacDonald and Annie McIntosh, as I said. She married John McMaster of the Carkner and McMaster lumber mill. John and Annie then moved to the Seattle area to build their own mill business, and they had 8 children. Duncan Carkner married Matilda Johnson, daughter of James Johnson and Jane Givens. Duncan joined the Kenmore Baptist Church a few months after its organization. He was a Bible class teacher for over 40 years. Also, he was choir leader and senior deacon. Duncan and Matilda had 7 children. John Givens married Frances Stringham. James married Luna Wallace. Annie married Alex Stewart. Nehemiah married Annabelle Dewar. Stanley married Isabella, or Bella, McVeigh. Jenny married Dr. Alex Robinson. And Lillian married Charles Dalgleish. Nehemiah married Janet Campbell, daughter of Alexander Campbell and Janet Ferguson. They had 2 children. Virtue married Alexander Johnson. Elizabeth married Samuel Irwin Kelly, and they had 6 children. Catherine married Peter Dashney. They had 2 children. John Alexander married Sarah Maria McVeigh, and they had 7 sons. Jesse, I believe, was unmarried. Robert William married Christina Ann Kennedy, and they had 5 children. And Permilla Margaret married Peter Allen MacDonald, son of Alan and Henrietta McLean MacDonald. They had 4 children. That's a lot of names, and some of them are duplicates, I understand. But come down with me with 2 of these family trees. John Givens and Frances Stringham had 3 children. They had Evelyn, who married Dr. George Edwards, and they had 2 children. Osgoode Stanton married Margaret Grummett, and they had 6 children. And Norma married John Russell Cinnamon. Norma Carkner Cinnamon lived into her 103rd year, and she was very proud to live with her husband John in the Carkner family home that her father died in 1951. And Stanley and Bella had 7 children. Catherine Marion died young. Nona Isabel married Walter William Cherry. Duncan died in 1944 in the RCAF. Helen Jean married Edward Booth. Phyllis married Thomas Fraser Curran. Joyce married Donald Fulford. And Doris married Dean Loney. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Doris Carkner Loney and Norma Carkner Cinnamon were both present at the Heritage Dedication Ceremony of Kenmore. Duncan Carkner's name appears on the monument at the Metcalfe Cenotaph as Osgoode Township men who died that we might live. There were 19 of those men. And Duncan was a soldier who died on duty at World War II, and his name is on the monument with my uncle William Gillisy and also Glenn Benson Loney, also of Kenmore. Now, I did find a Carkner that married into the Warren family of Kenmore, Marion Carkner, who married Verney Warren, but it appears that her family kind of came from away. Hawkesbury and Lachute, Quebec is what I'm seeing. I'll have to have a chat with the Warrens to see if there's a connection to the Ormond Carkners there, but it bears mentioning as the Warrens are a very well-known Kenmore family in their own right. And that is our historical segment for this week. Today's Community Voices is a blog article written by Jeff Mix, Face in the Blue, in November 2009. He writes that he went up to visit his grandparents in Gravenhurst, Ontario, and he was going through old family albums with them. They scanned over 100 photos. He made a discovery that day that was new to him, a 3-page document dealing how some of his ancestors founded the town of Kenmore just outside of Ottawa almost 200 years earlier. He writes, "The first known resident of Kenmore were 2 MacDonald brothers, William and John. In a letter written in 1832, a local named Archibald MacDonald lists them as having taken up residence on the Clergy Reserve, Lot 29, Concession 1, John on the north half and William on the south. When the Osgoode Township census was taken in 1841-1842, 3 brothers were shown side by side. The third was James. All were born in Ireland. William was a widower. John had 4 children at that time and had been in Canada for 14 years. William and James had been in Canada for 12. John was the eldest and had come at the same time as his wife Elizabeth Macmillan's parents. He worked on the Rideau Canal from 1827 till it was completed in 1842. They came to what would be called Kenmore in April 1832. The 3-page story that Jeff found was written by Mrs. William Reed, or Jane MacDonald Reed. She married a tailor named Reed, and when she was 80, she wrote this story. Early Days in the Ottawa Valley by Mrs. William Reed. My father arrived at the place around which the scenes of my story cluster in 1830, having previously been engaged in the construction of the Rideau Canal. He located on Lot 28, Concession 10, Township of Osgoode, now part of Kenmore. The land was sold by the Crown at a rate of 50 cents per acre. As I dictate my story, the original deed lies on the table before me. On his arrival, he located the site of his future home on the banks of the Castor River. A rude shanty was fashioned out of round logs, while for a roof, scoops hollowed out of basswood timber served as an overhead protection against the elements. Logs were reduced to a thickness desirable for flooring, being flattened, she used the word flatted, to suit the purpose. These were piled up until seasoned to be fit for further use. At the beginning of the following year, I myself was born, and in early spring was brought in along with my little brother, since deceased. Our family, along with our scanty household effects, were brought in within 6 miles of our location on an ox sleigh. My brother was carried the remainder of the distance in a shawl strapped to my father's back, while I was borne in my mother's arms. But this by no means made up their load, for in addition, they carried some provisions, dishes, and articles most necessary for immediate use. On arrival, a couple of pieces intended for flooring were placed for Mother to sit on, while Father busied himself in lighting a fire by means of the old flint and punk method, matches at this time being an unknown convenience. A hasty meal was prepared and partaken of, and then Father, after tackling a shawl over the opening intended for a door, barricaded it with pieces of flooring in order to guard us from the wild animals which infested these regions in the early days. He then returned for the balance of our effects and arrived back after midnight. No roads then existed, nothing but the blazed trail serving to guide the traveler through the trackless wilderness. The friendly torch, always used at night, served a twofold purpose. It lighted and showed the right trail to the woodsman, and it acted as a protection against the wild beasts. On Father's return, a hasty bed of balsam boughs was prepared, on which were thrown some blankets. Then, weary and almost exhausted with the day's fatigue, a few logs were rolled together to replenish the fire, and we retired. No chimney graced our early home. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. One great drawback we experienced in building up our early home was the inroads made upon our stock by the wild animals. I distinctly remember, as a girl of 5, seeing 7 wolves drinking at the river, coming up the bank in Indian file, and passing close to our shanty. At night, these denizens of the forest would break the stillness of the calm night and make the woods vibrate with their sharp howlings, filling our young hearts with terror. In later years, when, by much sacrifice, we have managed to secure some sheep, these unwelcome visitors destroyed as many as 7 in a single day. This also brings to my memory how these marauders deprived us of a fine 3-year-old heifer. Nothing but this bones telling the tale of the feast on our hard-earned, prized, and all too slim stock. Bears also were plentiful and gave us considerable inconvenience. On one occasion, we children were playing at my uncle's. 2 uncles had settled close by, when our attention was called to the pig pen by the squeals coming from it. Here we discovered that Mr. Bruin was the cause of the disturbance, and we speedily conveyed the intelligence to Mother, who summoned the men. The men brought their flintlocks. The bear was forced to take to a nearby tree, and one by one the men fired until one of their bullets found its mark. But by no means was the empty pigsty filled again. On this same day the men were called to 2 other families, and that night 3 dead bears told the story of their invasion. 4 years after our arrival, we secured our first yoke of oxen, and these greatly lessened the strenuous life of the early days. Our first start to clear away the primeval forest was on the bank of the river. The trees were cut into logs and rolled down the steep bank. A small clearing was then made and placed in tillable condition. The first implements were the grub hoe and the oak rake. When the oxen were introduced, an oak plow or jumper was used along with a V-shaped wooden drag in which were placed iron pins procured in Bytown, now Ottawa, the flourishing capital of our fair dominion. Logging bees of those days have been described in Ralph Connor's book, The Man from Glengarry, which recalls to us old settlers the days of strife and triumph. Our first cow had been procured by Father while he was at work on the canal and left at the front until provision could be made for her sustenance and shelter. On one occasion she strayed from her keeper, and following a winter road where she was picking up wisps of hay that had fallen from a lumberman's sleigh, she was mistaken for a bear. She narrowly escaped being shot. Her arrival at her new quarters was a day of rejoicing for us all. Henceforth, many long-felt wants were supplied. Food and clothing were obtained from Bytown, 25 miles distant, and carried in on the backs of men who took turns in this arduous task. The first wheat was taken to the mill, a distance of 35 miles in 2 canoes, the round trip occupying a week. On the return journey, the provisions had entirely disappeared, and the men, paddling back against the current, were famished and almost exhausted. They espied a large flat stone, came to shore, and kindled a flame on the stone. Then they later swept off the coals, mixed some of the flour and water in a basin which they carried and poured the mixture on the hot stone and waited until it was cooked. They always afterwards looked back on this repast as the finest of their lives. No less was the flour welcome to us at home, who anxiously waited and watched for the returning canoes, bread not having been in our house for 6 weeks. The first missionary was Reverend Daniel MacPhail, who traveled on foot at first and later on horseback. The first school was a little log building 2 miles distant. Here the youth were instructed, not in the modern and scientific methods of today, but in the crude, very crude form indeed. The school was called the Pay School. The teacher boarding round among families represented the school. Nevertheless, the men and women of those days were the medium whereby the liberal and advanced education of today was reached. In conclusion, I may state that some 47 years ago I was left as sole breadwinner for a young and somewhat large family. Just as an aside, somewhat large, she had 8 children. No channel, such as now exists, were open by which money might be obtained, and the busy loom had to be kept going far into the night in order to meet the over-recurring wants of the little flock. I now reside alone on a portion of an old pioneer farm, being the only survivor of those connected with this story. I am still, in spite of my 80 years, enjoying by the blessing of God a fair measure of good health. And as I sit on my veranda during the summer, instead of the ring of the woodsman's axe of long ago, there comes floating on the breeze, in strong contrast, the buzz of the circular saw and the dull hum of the planers. Jane Reed of Kenmore, 1910. Now, doesn't that just paint a picture for you? This is why I wanted to do this podcast, to keep alive the memories of how things used to be. Things like what was where your house is now are really interesting to the communities that exist now, the people who live here. And I find these things so interesting. Jane Reed gives us a great view of Kenmore back in the day, and preserving that history is important for the quiet village that Kenmore has become. Now, there's a lot of family tree history that I went down such a rabbit hole here, but I'm going to stop it here and just say that Jeff was William MacDonald's great-great-grandson. Of course, there are many MacDonalds in our area, and we'll cover them in due time in later episodes. But I know exactly what it's like to find old documents and memories of those who have lived before us. I can hear his excitement as a writer as he discovered this document. Our village of Kenmore was originally named by Peter McLaren, and then John McMaster and Annie Carkner moved to Seattle, Washington, and started the McMaster Shingle Mill in 1901. John was the first postmaster of the town and named it Kenmore, after his hometown here. And of course, Kenmore, Ontario, was named after the village the original settlers came from in Perthshire, Scotland, called Kenmore. I'm still not quite sure how someone can name a village on their own, but I love to hear that Peter McLaren and John McMaster both got to do that, to honor their homelands. And that is our Community Voices segment for this week. In today's mental health moment, we take a special opportunity to recognize an event that took place right before the holidays. There was a special ceremony in Kenmore for the Nugent family. There was a bench placed at the Kenmore Park Ball Diamonds, and it's dedicated to Liam Tripp Nugent, who was a Kenmore resident that died so very young of leukemia at age 21. His family and friends were present for the bench unveiling and dedication. I know exactly how this feels because the bench at Taylor Park in Osgoode is dedicated to my dad, Dick Blanchfield, who incidentally also died of leukemia, and also to Clarence Mussel. It really is a beautiful way for those who loved Liam to think of him when they're at the Ball Diamonds near his home. You can, of course, support funding and awareness for blood cancer research through the Life's a Trip Foundation, which is run by Liam's brother, Ryan. In keeping with that theme, for today's mental health moment, I want to share a poem from the Osgoode Township Poets book that Edna Downey gave to Mike Daly. This one is written by John Ferguson. John grew up in the Vernon area, and he wrote a beautiful poem called Home about how memories of how much he loved his home in which he was raised. And I thought that would be a suitable poem to share with you today for our mental health moment. I speak of home, its duties too, all pleasant to perform. From day to day I ever find in home the sweeter charm. I speak of home, fond cherished spot, of all on earth most dear, that home's a home where strife is not, where love the rule doth bear. I speak of home, my passions move, fond nature drops the tear, in memory of those I love, who made that home so dear. For one who oft this tender frame clasped to a loving breast, for one who often spoke my name and fondly me caressed. O lovely scenes still near, though classed with the fond baby's cry, scenes of my childhood and the past beneath a mother's eye. If home on earth be found so sweet, what must be in that store, where loving friends again shall meet, and meet to part no more. John Ferguson. I thought that was a nice little share today for Liam for the Carkner family, the MacDonald family, the McMaster family, all of the people who came from Perthshire, Scotland, and settled in Kenmore, Ontario, Kenmore, Washington, and all over the place. And so I just wanted to share that as a nice little mental health moment today. So that is this week's mental health moment. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Osgoode Community Chronicles. I hope you enjoyed our connections from the past and our taste of the present. I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit about the history of the village of Kenmore, the Carkner mill, the Carkner family, and their connections to other families in the area, and certainly our little homage to Liam Tripp Nugent. Remember, you can catch all of our past episodes on Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can also listen online at our website, osgoodecommunitychronicles.com, where we post additional resources and references to the things that we discuss, including the events that we mention to you. And you can follow us on social media on Facebook and on Instagram. Don't miss next week's episode, where we'll share more news and events in your area and more stories of families past and present. Thank you again for supporting our snapshot of our local community. I'm Tracy Daviero, and this has been Osgoode Community Chronicles, keeping our rural spirit alive, one story at a time. I'll see you next week.